My name is Yaniv Segal, and I'm the cover conductor for this week's program. So it's a fun program, probably an unusual program, unless you're a big fan of Scandinavian music, which I hope you are, and if not, then I hope you will be after tonight. The four composers on the program, we have Nielsen, Sibelius, Rautavaara, and one of them is not like the other, and that would be Beethoven, who is not Scandinavian, last time I checked. And I was just talking with a colleague who plays in the orchestra about, is the Beethoven Concerto, which is probably the most well-known piece on the program, is that kind of the odd one out? How does it fit in? And, well, I said, actually, it fits in quite a bit, because Sibelius was kind of considered to be the Beethoven of Finland. And he followed in this big grand symphonic tradition, and for many defines the music of Finland. And so I think that that's a nice parallel between Beethoven and Sibelius, and kind of makes sense why it's on the program. And then Rautavaara, who I don't know if anybody's heard of him or heard his music. Amazing composer. He then was another Finnish composer who then lived in the shadow of Sibelius. So those composers are connected. And then the composer that opens the program, Carl Nielsen, was a contemporary of Sibelius, but from Denmark. So similar struggles or similar things you might hear in the music, but written around the same time, but very different styles. So I thought, I can ask, have you all heard the Beethoven Piano Concerto before? C minor, the third piano concerto? An amazing piece. So I think I'll just start a little bit on that one, since it's the most familiar. I don't think I need to spend too much time about it. But I can talk about what makes it really interesting for me, musically, and in its place in history. Beethoven wrote 5 piano concertos, and the first 2 are more modest in size, and then the third and the fourth and the fifth, kind of like his third symphony, they greatly expand the role of the piano, the orchestra, this sense of drama within a concerto. Louis Lortie, the fabulous pianist who was playing today, said, in this type of concerto, it's really equal forces between the piano and the orchestra. The orchestra has a very important part, and Beethoven kind of created that tradition. He was deeply influenced in this work by Mozart's C minor piano concerto. So the homage there in the same key, similar, Mozart, his two minor key concertos also were kind of his biggest of the piano concerto repertoire. So Beethoven is taking a page out of his playbook. But there's one specific thing in Mozart's C minor concerto that is really incredible, and that's in the first movement, when the cadenza, the pyrotechnics of the piano solo, when that cadenza is over. Normally, up till that moment, that movement would just kind of come to an end. And Mozart added this whole extra section after the cadenza. And Beethoven happened to hear this in a rehearsal, in an open air rehearsal that he was walking by with his friend, and he stopped and he said, I'll misquote it, but basically that is the most incredible thing I've ever heard. It's just absolute genius. What Mozart did there is he took his earlier themes, tied them together in a new way, and then expanded the whole concept of that first movement. So Beethoven uses that in his first movement of this concerto as well. After the cadenza is over, it's new material, it's eerie, it doesn't quite have a place, and then it comes to the roaring conclusion. But that's a definite homage to Mozart. The second movement of the Beethoven concerto is kind of in an odd key. Keys are very important for Beethoven, and so we're in C minor, and then he goes to a completely unrelated key of E major for the second movement, which is a really wild shift when you end that first movement, and then the second note, the second movement, once it starts, you're like jarred out of this realm you've been in. And yet the music is beautiful and serene and calm, and he takes you along on that journey. But it's a really interesting shift if you kind of stay in that world for just a minute. Hopefully the audience will be nice and quiet. Not too much coughing, although if you have to cough, you're going to cough. And between the movements is probably a good place to do it. And then it's just a most magical movement. And then the last movement is kind of a standard, rondo. I don't want to say standard, but it returns to the C minor world. And at the end, he brightens it. So of course, once again, this key relationship is very important for Beethoven. So this C minor turning into the major at the end, it's not uncommon to do that, but he does this again, of course, in his Fifth Symphony most famously, the triumph of the sunny over the dark and the despair. So, in a nutshell, this is the kind of things maybe that I think about when I'm listening to this amazing concerto, and it's preceded by a work that it's the first time the Detroit Symphony Orchestra is playing it. When I studied it for this week, it was certainly the first time I had ever encountered it. It's a concert overture by Carl Nielsen, the Danish composer. He was born in 1865, actually the same year Sibelius was born. Luckily it says in your programs, because I'm terrible with dates. He died in 1920-something, I believe. Sibelius lived quite a bit longer, 1957, something of that sort. But anyway, so they're born at the same time, and so, the Civil War, right, 1865? That's like a whole world apart. We were looking at these great works of music and thinking about what was going on in the world. Well, the world was going to bits over here. So this is an overture, but it's not that's just because that's the title. It's not actually an overture to any greater work. It's not a dramatic overture. It's not an opera overture. It's a fantasy, a tone poem that Nielsen wrote in honor of some visiting guests from the Faroe Islands. Now, these islands are owned by Denmark. In the Kingdom of Denmark, I should say. I think now they're self-governed, but they're really far out there. Hundreds of miles from the nearest mainland, about halfway, I think, between the European continent and Iceland. So remote. Unusually temperate because of the Gulf Stream. But, they have their own culture, they have their own language. And so in writing this piece for tribute, Carl Nielsen wrote a piece of almost program music. And what does program music mean? Well, he actually didn't really like to write that programmatic music. It means music that has some kind of story or picture or specific imagery in mind throughout the music, without words. His symphonies are, very much absolute music. It's music for the purpose of music. Well, he's telling a story here, and he's got an unusual symphonic language. It's unlike anybody else, really. It's definitely influenced by Romanticism and the extension of tonality and harmony, but it doesn't sound like the other people around that time, like the Wagners or Liszt or Schumann. It's very much his own way of doing things. So you're going to hear first what seems to be a very long boat journey. And that would make sense, because they're not going to fly there in the 1800s or early 1900s. So you've got this sense of rolling waves and things moving at a bigger time scale. Out of nowhere, you're going to hear some piercing wind playing by the clarinet and by the flute, and these are bird calls, transcribed bird calls into the orchestra. So maybe we're nearing land. And then a distant trumpet fanfare, okay? So we're approaching, that disappears again into the mist and then comes back. So this is very much telling the story of approaching to an island. Then it gets a little bit more convoluted while we're there. So it doesn't follow a narrative structure, even though the music is descriptive. He incorporates common folk tunes from the Faroe Islands, I think 3 of them. there is a really, really raucous party. It sounds like a lot of fun. The orchestra goes crazy. It's like they're competing with each other who can dance and drink the most loud. The percussion, our conductor, John Storgaards, actually said to the percussion, just play with all your force. And it's a lot of fun. So that's a really wild party scene, interrupted by these kind of moments of peace and serenity with these folk tunes from the islands. And then just as quickly as we arrive at the island, we leave again. And it ends in a really fascinating manner with just a solitary clarinet. And now the instrument of the clarinet, one of the things that it does really well is it can completely disappear into silence, more so than any other instrument. It can come out of nowhere and disappear into nowhere. And so there's a long note with a long fermata, and we just sit there waiting for that solitary note, I think the islands in the distance. You know, you might lean forward and say, is it still playing or not? It'll get that soft, and then it disappears. And that's the whole piece. And so this piece actually ties in really nicely with the opening of the second half, where we have a piece by, I really don't know how to say his first name. I'm sorry. Eino Juhani, I believe, something like that. Rautavaara, this Finnish composer. He just died a few years ago. He was born 1935 or 1930s, 1920, 1928. Okay, so he overlapped with Nielsen then a few years. They probably didn't know each other, but this is a concerto for birds. And instead of putting the bird calls into the orchestra, he actually went to northern Finland and recorded them, and then created electronic tracks of these birds, which then the orchestra plays along with. So the three different movements have different bird species or different birds doing whatever birds do. We can't tell them to play any faster or slower because it's a recording. They're going to play at exactly the speed at which they're playing. We can balance it. So part of my job as an assistant conductor is to be here doing rehearsals and to sit and walk around the hall and maybe point out some balance things. Like the speakers, that are going to be playing the bird calls are actually farther downstage than the conductor. So the conductor isn't able to hear how the birds sound in relation to how the orchestra sounds because of that distance. So the volume of the birds is being controlled by a percussionist in the back who pushes play on a CD player and then has a mixer. And I'll be hiding somewhere in the hall where he can see me. So we've already, rehearsed those moments to where he knows where he needs to come up and come down. But during the concert, I will still be showing him some signals in case they're either too loud or too soft. And Rautavaara was a deeply spiritual person. His entire life, one of the things that he kept on coming back to was some kind of very strong premonition he had when he was a kid. And you can just hear in his music these kind of great expanses. And that comes out of the Scandinavian tradition, which you hear in Nielsen, which you're going to hear in Sibelius. And he's a really fine composer. He's got a number of symphonies and concertos. This, perhaps, is one of his most frequently programmed pieces, even though I believe it's also a DSO premiere. It's not, sometimes people get a little scared if they see Concerto for Birds, and it's written in 1970-something, and you're like, oh no, what's that going to sound like? Don't worry, it sounds beautiful. It's peaceful. You hear the nature, the interaction between the orchestra and the tracks is pretty cool. And he did, of course, put in some of those bird-like elements into the orchestra. So at the opening of the first movement, the orchestra is kind of imitating what the bird calls are. And nature, in general, has been such a major influence, of course, for lots of composers, including Beethoven, including, Messiaen, the French composer, transcribed bird calls as much as he could and tried to write them out. They're very hard to actually do accurately. I heard one of the coolest pieces once with in a composition class. It was this really, really slow melody. It seemed to take maybe a minute or two. Just one solitary melody, very low, beautiful. And then the composer had it played twice as fast and up an octave. It took half the time. And then again, and then again, and then again. And eventually it actually turned out to be a bird call. And so in fact, what they're doing with their whistling and calling is quite complex. And it's so fast that we can't even tell. But when you do slow it down, it's amazing, like whale calls, So nature, is beautiful and amazing. An homage to composers before him, as well as to his own unique voice. And then that takes us to the last piece on the program, which is Sibelius's 7th Symphony. It was the final symphony that he completed. He stopped writing in sometime in the early 30s, even though he lived another 20-something years. He supposedly wrote drafts and sketches of an 8th Symphony, but he burned them, so we have nothing left. And he was somebody who struggled deeply with a lot of personal demons and alcoholism and self-doubt and criticism. And, his music is in some ways directly descendant, as I mentioned earlier, out of the Beethoven symphonic tradition. But if you look at what's going on in the rest of Europe at the turn of the century, you have these crazy progressives, Debussy, Ravel in the French tradition, Schoenberg and Webern, starting to really push the boundaries of tonality and musical structure. And so Sibelius had a hard time kind of figuring out where he fit into that. So it's too bad he stopped writing after this. I mean, this symphony is an incredible achievement. It's in one movement. And when it was first written, it was described actually as a symphonic fantasy. And there was the question of whether, like the Nielsen that opens the program, that he was thinking about some kind of narrative behind it. He insists that there's no narrative, and eventually it did become called a symphony by his own titling. And music theoreticians, critics have struggled to say what is the structure even of this work, because it doesn't fit into the normal concept of what a symphonic movement or symphony should be. There are elements that refer to each other. There are definite key areas. There are very, traditionally Sibelius-like sounds, how he uses the orchestra, the use of scalar motifs, the sections, very much winds will do something, strings will do something. The fact that sometimes you never quite feel settled, he can manipulate and move you. And maybe I'm getting too technical because none of that really matters. You can just sit back and say, this is pretty glorious. Because he really knows how to make the orchestra sound good. And so there's one description of two particular moments which I think are very apt, and apt also because they are not theoretical definitions. They don't use musicologist language. There's an amazing expanse of sound, and then out of that, somehow organically, a solo trombone melody kind of, it's within the texture, but it just comes out of everything. And the first couple of minutes seem to drive you all the way to that moment, and then we go wandering for about 10 minutes, and we come back to that moment, and then you know we're coming to a conclusion. So a musician called these the cornerstones of this symphony. And I think that's a really good way of thinking about these moments. And if the first movement passes by and you might not even realize it, when it comes back the second time, you'll be like, I've heard that before. And you'll see what I mean. Now, out of all of this, grandiose sounds, the ending is kind of abrupt. We end up somehow coming to the very pure key of C major. At the very, very last moment, all the notes just align for a split second in a gorgeous sound, and then he doesn't even let the conductor hold it. It's not a long note. There's no fermata on it. You cannot even indulge in that sound. And I was thinking about Finland, and I asked our conductor this week about where he lives, and because I looked online and I said, gosh, the average annual temperature is something like 33 degrees. And I asked him about how dark it is in the winter, because it also said that in the winter they get about 6 minutes of sunlight. So just think about that C major chord as that moment, and then it's gone. You can't linger in it. You let your kids out for recess, you got to call them in like 6 minutes. And he actually said something very nice, that the snow cover there is quite consistent in the winter. And where he lives, in Lappland, is less cloudy than farther south. So you might not have sunlight, but with the moon and with the stars and with the white surfaces everywhere reflecting everything, he says, actually, it doesn't really feel that dark. That's interesting. I'd like to go. And I probably want to make sure I'm outside in those 6 minutes. And so, in the 1800s, in the early 1900s, probably people spent a lot of time inside and reflecting. And I think you can hear that in Sibelius' music. He had a composing cabin that was remote and in the woods. And these kind of grandiose shapes and wind and sounds of nature around him find their way into his music and into this symphony. It's really, I think, a great work. And one other thing I will say is, actually, timing-wise, it's listed at about 22 minutes. But a 22-minute single movement that is so organic, you feel like this is a symphony, of symphonic proportions and symphonic length. So the title absolutely fits. This concept of one movement for a work originated in Beethoven in his Fifth Symphony. There's that famous connection from the third to the fourth movement. And so he's already creating the concept of a symphony as a whole, one work. Sibelius uses this technique in his earlier works as well. In his Fifth Symphony, he combines some movements, for example. And since then, the symphony can mean a lot of different things. It can mean a collection of movements, it can mean a single movement, it can mean two movements. And so I think that this is a perfect, progression through these composers, all related through either nature or through their concept of the orchestra or the organic whole of a work. And so it's a really great program, full of music that most likely we haven't heard in a concert hall. So I hope you come with open ears and open minds, and I hope you can take away as much as you can and enjoy these sound worlds, because they're pretty unique, and I find them very inspiring. I get to listen to it all week, so I'm looking forward to tonight. I have about 5 minutes left if there are some questions about what I've said, or some of the pieces, or about symphonic life in general, or I don't know if there are or not. If you Google Sibelius 7, what you actually get is software, because there's a couple of major notation software for composers, and for whatever reason, they named one of them Sibelius. And so I looked something up about Sibelius. I said something like, did Sibelius go crazy? And what you got was a bunch of people complaining about things in Sibelius software that made them go crazy. That's changed the world of composition entirely, being able to put everything into the computer and then having it play back right at you instead of creating everything necessarily in your head. So the music world has definitely changed, and the styles of composition have changed, thanks in part to things like Sibelius or Finale. But anyway, yes, please. Anybody? Yes, there we go. The question is, did I have a favorite? Or what was my favorite, and why? The favorite question. As a conductor, my answer to that is my favorite piece is the one I'm conducting at the moment. And it has to be that because you have to love what you're doing. And you have to understand the composer, and if you're not in love with the music, why are we performing it? Listening, each one is so different. I've actually, of course, come across Beethoven 3 many times, so I think I might leave that one out because that's kind of in a different world. The Rautavaara I got to cover a few years ago, and I got to run the soundboard, and I was just amazed at the interaction. And so that, like, with this balance of natural sounds and orchestral sounds. So in this program, that kind of sound is my favorite. In the Nielsen, that party scene in the middle is just so wacky. I wish I could write something like that. And then in the Sibelius, I mean, that's the most meat and potatoes of this program. So I don't want to say favorite, but what he's able to do and how he's able to manipulate us in 20 minutes is just incredible. So each one kind of has something that they can really do for me. Yes? Any other? Yes, please. What do I do as a cover conductor? So a cover or an assistant conductor means, as I mentioned, in rehearsals, I'm out in the hall to give advice on balance or the perception out in the hall. Depending on the concert hall, the stage and where the conductor stands, which is of course a pretty good place to hear the orchestra, may or may not be an accurate representation of how it sounds out there because of the acoustics and nature and physics of instruments. So there's a level of balancing. And then the other thing is, give pre-concert talks. No, but if John were to fall ill at the last minute, I would be expected to jump in and conduct in his place. So to be prepared as an understudy for a Broadway show or play, there's that aspect, and then there's also the rehearsal aspect. And after every break during rehearsals, after rehearsals, many times conductors might ask, did you hear the English horn at that spot in the third movement? So you can't be out there zoning out and looking at Facebook. You have to be paying attention, and you never know. Or did the tempo of the third movement feel too fast? Did it make sense? Did that come across? It's a different sense of being a listener and being a performer. And so having an assistant allows that kind of dialogue at any level, from technical to artistic, or to, adjusting the balance of a bird call. Yes, one more. How many rehearsals does a typical professional orchestra have for a classical concert? It's generally 4 rehearsals. This week was a very standard rehearsal process. Started on Tuesday morning, had 2 rehearsals on Wednesday, a dress rehearsal this morning, and tonight is the first concert. It's very quick. Everybody comes to the first rehearsal fully prepared. They get the music ahead of time. They know their parts. So orchestra rehearsal isn't for them to learn their parts. It's for them to learn everybody else's parts and how they fit in together, and to follow the general shape provided by the conductor. Thank you so much for coming, and I hope you enjoy the concert.